Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
Do you know anyone who truly went crazy? What happened? Serious. There was a woman we knew growing up. Her husband left her for another woman. She grieved for longer than most would consider normal, and tried everything to get him back. Her kids saw her downfall, and preferred to stay with their now more stable father and his young wife that they could relate to. She then started drinking, not necessarily an alcoholic, but she was just driving her despair. It's been 15 years now and she is a shell of herself and a different person. Writes crazy things on Facebook, or did back when I had it, and has pushed everyone away except her multiple cats. Just literally lost her. It was sad to see because we would visit her growing up and she was fun and happy. I don't know if that's exactly crazy, but I think that she is now could be described this way. I had a good friend in first-year university. We lived in the same floor. He was an Alberta good old boy. Loved the drink, but had never smoked weed. He got real into it real fast. Still did fine in school though. Fast forward to second year. He had his sister deliver him like 2 pounds of weed. She worked for a bus company and could somehow move it pretty easily. The stuff was crazy. I'm a heavy weed smoker, but this stuff was not quite right. Only smoked it the once and it was mental. We were bouncing off the walls. Well, after a month or two of smoking this stuff, his mental state got worse and worse. We saw less of him, he stopped going to classes. Smoked all night and slept all day. At one point my roommate tried to buy some weed of him. He gave an initial price that was way above market price, and my roommate tried to haggle, at which point the dude just immediately gave up and just gave him 2 ounces for free. Basically the next day, he just snapped. He taped what was left of the 2 pounds bag to his chest, and walked it into the police station. Lifted up his shirt and said, "This is why I'm here." Side note for context, it was 2001 and weed was still illegal in Canada. But at that point the Toronto police force had publicly stated they wouldn't be pursuing people for marijuana possession, effectively, and unofficially, decriminalizing it, but still over a decade and a half away from legalization for recreational use. We were in a smaller city about an hour outside of the GTA. So anyways, the cops arrest him, obviously, and at this point he starts ranting about robot bees spying on him, that the CIA was following him, and all sorts of nonsense. They ended up charging him with possession with intent to distribute. But given his clearly deranged mental state, only sentenced him to 1-year probation and house arrest under supervision of his family. At his trial, his parents mentioned there was a history of schizophrenia in the family. He ended up moving back home and we never saw or heard from him again. Cops indicated that the weed was laced with something but they weren't sure what. One officer suggested it might have been PCP, that seemed hyperbolic, but who knows. Suffice to say we threw out the 2 ounces we had left. My mom told me this story. When she was a child, there used to be this old lady that like clockwork would go banging the door of every house in her village, every single day at the same time. Back then there weren't any licensed doctors, but the old lady had some sort of mental illness that was undiagnosed. People think it's because all her children never survived infanthood, so she went mad. It didn't help that her husband left her for another woman too. Anyway, when one day the old lady didn't bang the door, everyone was curious to what happened to her as it was a regular thing. They checked her house and she wasn't there. Now this was alarming as she mostly came out of her house to buy food and bang doors, and no one at the market had seen her that day too. So a manhunt ensued. It lasted 3 days, and the poor thing was found in a well, drowned and her body swollen because of how long she was in there. It took 3 days to find her because the well was fairly far off, and in a secluded spot. My mum says all she remembers now was the smell of the body. The well had to be closed off and filled with concrete. And yeah, that's my story, as told by my mum. I knew, notice the past tense, a guy who at around 40 was a very charming fellow. Had a nice family, everyone thought well of him and he was welcome at any gathering. Had a master's degree and, probably, a solid 6-figure income. I personally knew him about 3 to 4 years like this. Then came the car accident where he suffered a serious brain injury. He made a full physical recovery, but he was a completely different person from that point. He was now prone to random, and frequent, extremely violent anger for no apparent reason, and within only a few months his wife moved away, taking the children and citing fear for their lives. Of course, he refused any help since it was everyone else that was crazy in his view. Undeterred, he took up a drug habit and a new woman, an addict herself. About 2 years after the car accident he was murdered after picking a fight with some drug dealer. I knew someone who had a TBI, and that is typical behavior of them. Friend was an all-star student at university working on an engineering degree, super reliable, friendly and chill. After he repeatedly tried to go back but couldn't focus on the school work and his 7-year relationship ended, "Audrey, you cheating," and was gaslighting him. He was still super friendly and pretty chill but would get frustrated pretty easily. We had some deeper conversations and I can't fault him for getting frustrated about something easier. He told me he can still remember everything but it just won't come up into the surface for days or weeks later. How simple things suddenly became difficult, but you still know how to do them, or how to handle something but your brain won't connect the dots while knowing where the dots are. He eventually had to give up on school and moved back home to live with his mom, and we slowly lost touch. Jake, if you happen to read this, I love you, man, and you're a wonderful person. I had a patient on my psych unit for a couple years who is now in a long-term facility. She's in her 50s, she was a teacher and lived a pretty normal life. I'm not sure exactly what transpired, but she lived with her elderly mother. Mom passed away and she had a psychotic break. She was admitted because she was found driving around with her mom's body in the passenger seat. She had been driving around with her mom's body in the middle of the summer for 5 days. She became violent and paranoid, and she would regularly speak about her mother as if she was still alive, would tell us all about how they were going on vacation, etc., for years after the incident. She never recovered and was deemed incapable of making her own decisions and was court-ordered to a long-term facility, indefinitely last I saw her. It's terrifying the way she went from a functional person to her current state out of nowhere. I was on a maintenance crew in a large apartment complex. It can be very difficult to find reliable, capable people. Well, we hear this guy. He's capable, for sure, good at fixing things and easy to get along with. All seems good. One day, he's showing me his car. He liked to tinker and he was showing me this kill switch he installed. Pretty slick home job, I'm impressed. Suddenly he's asking me these odd questions about our boss/supervisor. Stuff like, has boss been talking bad about them? Did I think he was going to get fired? Kind of doom and gloom. When he was doing really well, we all liked him. So not long after, the supervisor heads to the leasing office because a resident had called and said they saw something off at the office. Like someone was there after hours. So boss was just checking up on things, which turned out to be nothing. Until coworker shows up and starts pounding on the door. Boss locked it as a precaution. Good thing too, he brought his 5-year-old daughter with him. We lived on site, so she just tagged along. Anyhow, pounding on the door. Screaming threats. Boss is understandably freaking out with his daughter there. So he calls the cops, they show, coworker is hauled off. Turns out he was bipolar and never disclosed it to anyone. He had apparently gone off his lithium because he felt fine and thought he didn't need it. Then went back on and had a psychotic episode when it kicked in. Never heard from him again. I was bummed since getting decent people was so hard. I just hope he got the help he needed. Had another coworker in another job who had quit. Then a couple of weeks later he came back to catch up with some folks in the shop and walked out with a bunch of tools, including a cordless drill I'd saved for a while to get. Well, he was into drugs in a bad way and was just trying to score some quick cash. I would have been more upset about it, but he apparently went on kidnap some poor fella, beat him to death in a drug-fueled haze. I guess that was his rock bottom. Last I'd heard he plead guilty and was doing time. I just hope it was his rock bottom and he was able to straighten his life out. My younger sister, 15 to 16 at the time, could get away with murder because my mum was a doormat when it came to raising her. When she was younger she could do no wrong. Then as a teenager my mum's strategy was to let her walk all over her and the rest of us to keep the peace, since her outbursts were a nightmare and worse for everyone than just letting her get away with stuff. Nothing was ever her fault and I needed to be the bigger person in every argument, even if I was a victim of physical violence from her. Well, my mum was sick of my sister refusing to go to school. She was physically too strong to be dragged out, because my younger brother was starting to refuse as well, so my mum took her phone. She lost it. She was screaming, crying, was saying she'd call the police for abuse and was going up to every family member threatening them to lend her a phone so she could call the police on my mum. Luckily my ride to school got there before she could start anything with me. But I missed a large chunk of the issues. At first she sulked in her room. Then my mum took her grocery shopping because she didn't trust her home alone, but let her sit in the car to listen to the radio since she had supposedly calmed down. Well, she got out of the car, went to a nearby cafe and to a cashier crying asking if she could call the police on her phone. My mum found her before she could and luckily she didn't get a chance to since my mum explained a vague version of the situation. There was one point where my mum tried to get her to speak to a professional, but they wouldn't talk walk-ins unless it was a crisis. Eventually my mum just asked her if she'd call the police if she got her phone back. She said she wouldn't, so she got it back and it was like nothing happened. She did eventually go to live with my aunt until she turned 18 though, so my brother and I got some peace and my mum got the respect she deserved. Guy I was friends with in elementary and middle school with. He was one of the popular kids since he was one of the class clowns, had loving parents who would saw off a limb if he ever really wanted something and was musically inclined. Well, at one point his parents put him on Ritalin at a young age and never really had the drug talk with him. So sometime in high school and college he started doing heavier drugs after he was taken off of Ritalin and Adderall. His mental health started declining because of it and his parents eventually kicked him out after years of trying their best to get him back on track. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, watching his YouTube channel going from his music to shock humor, to videos about the cult he joined and the number of times he randomly showed up at my doorstep after disappearing for a few years. I still feel bad for the guy and wish I could have helped him, but he made his choices and I wasn't exactly in the position to give mental health or drug recovery advice. Worked with incredible women in a kitchen. She was in her early 30s or late 20s if I recall. Wednesday nights were the busiest night of the week as it was BOGO sushi. This was an insane night every week and servers could easily take home $500 in tips. This night, a kitchen manager, I'll call her Jessica, was obviously loaded with kitchen chaos. She had received several phone calls from her very close friend. Since we were so busy she could not answer the calls and put her phone on silence. As I remember, this friend was also her roommate or former roommate. All I know is they were essentially sisters. When she got off work, Jessica found a voice message from her friend waiting to be opened. Jessica listened to the voice message and it was her best friend begging for her to call her back. In the message the friend was crying and stated she was going to end her life. Jessica immediately called 911 and her friend back. Disparagingly, Jessica's dear friend had taken her own life. As a result, Jessica took the blame. The next day she missed work and went completely insane very quickly. She submitted herself to a psychiatric facility within a few days. Jessica stayed there for several months on watch. She lost her job, required prescription medication to remain stable, and was never the same person again. As far as I know, she has never recovered. I think now she lives with her parents. Jessica was a very strong person and fun to be around. Within hours of these events she became completely new person. Through the grapevine I've been told she is catatonic most times and can't contain herself. It's crazy to think that something like this can happen so fast. My son. He started college and couldn't keep track of assignments. He felt like everyone was judging him. He started accusing us of saying horrible things to him that we absolutely did not say. He couldn't sleep at night, and slept all day. We thought it was a form of narcolepsy until he had a psychotic episode where his reflection in the television made a horrible face at him. He was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder at age 20. The disease can cause brain damage which in his case impaired his memory and critical reasoning skills. He requires supervision because he will do things like forget he put food in the oven. He also doesn't remember to perform any self-care or take his medication without prompting. He had severe depression before the schizoaffective, and that has been difficult to manage as comorbidity because drugs that alleviate one may make the other worse. He is fairly stable now. He had wanted to be a journalist. That's not really feasible now, but he has started freelance writing about his passion, video games. He needs a little help sometimes, but he still writes better than most people I know, and he's still my beloved child. My wife's very good friend who's always been a bit quirky, but when my wife passed away 5 years ago the friend went downhill very quickly. I learned that it runs in her family. Her older sister has spent decades believing that she was being stalked by someone. Then the friend became convinced the same guy was also stalking her. I did my best to help her, and I have to admit it was very difficult for me at that time. I wound up calling the girl's parents. Spent an hour speaking with them, explaining what I had seen and what their daughter was saying/doing. At the end of the hour I told the mother as gently as I could that it seemed that she, the mother, believed the stories were true. And that was enabling both her daughters to maintain the delusion. That was a tough conversation, and unfortunately it didn't help in the end. A guy I was seeing a few years ago. I thought we were hitting it off great, even met his mom. One day 2 FBI agents show up to my house in a black SUV, start questioning me. Apparently they got a tip that I had been inappropriate with minors, online grooming stuff. Just really vile, over-the-top stuff. I was so terrified I turned my phone off and stayed at a friend's house that night, level scared. 2 days later I get a novel of a text from that guy. Apparently he was schizophrenic and stopped taking his meds. The delusions were telling him I was hurting people, specifically kids. He apologized profusely and informed me he was going into an inpatient facility and wouldn't be able to talk to me for a while. I wished him well, blocked him, and have never heard or seen from him again. I shudder to think about all the times we were alone together. Had his delusions told him something else? Who knows? I have a friend who went to psychiatry hospital and we spent time together just hours before his parents took him there. He had a potential to get schizophrenia, and because he was smoking weed heavily it persuaded him into the passive-aggressive state in which his persona was altering from greedy politician, talking about some non-existent, classified, local state projects and businesses and acting like he is in charge for those. Then he was someone that is being watched by some kind of Illuminati. He showed us his screen background of a beaten cat and started yelling, "Did you see what they did to me? They set this up." And Minnie cried for less than a second. When we asked who set this up, he became angry and said, "Stop pretending you don't know. We all know who," and if one of us asked him again, he would get personal and started swearing over him. His voice tone was also very alternating. In some cases we laughed to his ideas, but in some we just gave ourselves those awkward looks because we knew something was off. The way he spoke looked really convincing. He truly believed those fictions. My neighbor was collecting garbage and dragging it home. Her apartment was a huge stinking hole. It is known for sure that she was a teacher at school, taught algebra, but what became a turning point in her life is not exactly known. Almost everyone said that her 2 sons were connected with criminal structures and they were killed in front of her. This was the starting point of her madness. Recently she died and lay in the apartment for several months. No one noticed the corpse smell because her apartment smelled like a real garbage dump. Her dog fed on her body and later starved to death. Here is such a terrible death in the past of a kind and intelligent woman. In my town there was a lady that would walk around town with a bike helmet covered in tin foil. No one knew her actual name, so we all just called her Helmet Lady. Her husband left her in her early 30s with her 2 kids. He divorced her and the reason he gave was because she was crazy. But that was just the beginning. Helmet Lady was in her 50s by the time I was able to understand what was going on. She would walk to my dad's office and try to get things from him. It would be totally random things that wouldn't even make sense for the business he was in. She wrote a novel one day and brought it to him. It was all in English but didn't make much sense. The parts that we were able to understand, she talked about how everyone should wear helmets like hers so that when aliens come down they can't suck out our brains. She mentioned the devil in many of her sentences. After my dad sent the novel off to people higher up, she disappeared. I didn't know until a couple years ago that she was sent to an asylum. When they went to pick her up at her house they said she was running around spitting gibberish and acting super weird, but no drugs were in her system. My dad is friends with the local cops and they said while searching her place they found a lot of letters and novels describing how the devil was going to take us all to hell and that the aliens were actually demons hidden in plain sight. She had about 200 crosses on her bedroom walls all turned upside down and a trashed house. This was the only crazy lady that I knew of in my town. But I will never forget her. My mom was verbally abused by my dad since I was very young. One day, I came back from school and saw my mom on the floor, crying. I comforted her, thinking she was just sad, and told her we could take a nap together and she'll feel better. But then I woke up finding her not by my side. As I walked downstairs, I saw all the lights in the house on and all the cabinets, door, window, and closet, just anything that you can open, were open. The whole house was so bright, yet the slit of each open furnitures looked so dark. It was like as if there were holes everywhere. I don't know why, but that scene disturbed me so much. I tried to close as many openings as I could. Then I found my mum outside of the door, desperately, aggressively breathing for air. The rest of the night, I tried to calm her down and take her into the house, but she just screamed so loud, saying that there were no stars in the sky and the demons were coming. In the end, I called the ambulance while crying, and they took her to the hospital. I witnessed her yelling brutally on the patient bed. Some relatives took me out of the room before I saw my mum getting pinned down for an injection. A few nurses came to check on my mum's room, and I just teared up in front of them. She was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. I was 15 at the time. I have come back to finish the story. 10 years later, same company. I had a corner executive office. Who cares? That is not important to me anymore. I repeat. The owner had 8 siblings and many nephews. There is a moral to this story. One day, it was a Friday. My boss Richard told me we just found out Scott has been embezzling the company. I had only seen Scott one time, 5 years prior. I was going through some old phone numbers. So I wondered if Scott's phone number still works. By now he has been let go. Now is Monday, August 20th. 9:04 a.m. I was curious if Scott was still there. I, for no reason, just called the old number. My boss answered. I told him, "Oh, I must have dialed the wrong number." He said, "That's okay. By the way, we are taking him to court." A few hours later, they sent their little nerdy nephew to fire me, for no reason. I had been loyal to this company for 14 years. He told me he was calling the police on me if I didn't leave. I told him I did nothing wrong at all. I hadn't even called in sick but one time in 14 years. He said, "We don't need a reason. Texas is an at-will state. No reason necessary." I did leave.
Back when we were dating, my husband got a seasonal job in a very wealthy area, and I'd often go see him. There was this one middle-aged guy who would sleep randomly on the sidewalks, but everyone seemed to know him and was very kind to him. Let him sleep in their yards, etc. One day I asked my husband about this guy. Turns out, the guy was from a very successful family. I think they were photographers, if I remember right, and he was training with them to follow in their footsteps. He got to be a relatively big name himself, but he got on the wrong track and started doing drugs. He ended up doing so many, it did permanent damage to his brain. This man owns a whole, literal mansion, on the street he sleeps on. Only his brain is too far gone to remember, so it sits empty. Apparently on top of being successful and an heir, he was a philanthropist and very well-spoken/charming before he went off the deep end. It's sad. My brother-in-law wasn't diagnosed yet as bipolar with schizophrenic tendencies. His grandmother passed and a flip switched. A few days after the funeral, he started believing he was God. My husband still has recordings. He didn't sleep for days, was taking drugs, and was talking about how he made the world and my husband was a god, I was a goddess, and his fake girlfriend was created by him. "We are the creators," was said almost constantly. It was almost unbelievable how he was talking. He then showed up at a local community college and burst into some random classroom saying he was God and had the power to take their lives. He left and couldn't be identified, but we found out he did this a few hours later through his crazy talk. My husband went to call screeners to get him admitted, and he heard him on the phone. Picked up a stool, bashed my husband over the head repeatedly, thought he killed him, and then ran. The house looked like someone was murdered. Husband needed 40 stitches above his eyebrow. Cops found him a day later walking the streets in a town about 20 miles away. He went to jail, was on suicide watch, and it was a long year until the right medication was found. Now you wouldn't even know. My husband needed to go in front of a grand jury to testify on his behalf so he wouldn't do more time for assault. We watch closely that he's on his meds because if off, he is dangerous and unwell. Watching someone be normal one day then think they are God the next, and try to kill his brother is quite traumatic. I'm a female and have selective memory loss, so some of this story may be foggy or missing parts, but here we go. For the first 10 years of my life, before I was adopted, I lived in a very poverty-stricken area in an abusive household. My parents were very neglectful and at times would physically hurt us kids. I had many siblings, at least 6, and was taken care of by my older sister. At the time I had an older brother we'll call Eric, who from the very start wasn't very centered. None of us really were, of course, but he was on a different level. At first, He just had fun stomping on insects, ripping ants apart, smashing frogs with his shoes. Disgusting things, but it was tame compared to what he'd do. Of course, we weren't able to get him any help since we couldn't afford it, so instead my siblings and I, avoided him like the plague, leaving when he would enter, hiding until he would leave, taking long routes to not run into him. Now that I think back, that likely made it worse. Either way, he moved on from insects to rats and lizards, at first just straight killing them, but then he started mutilating them, torturing them, ripping off legs, heads, tails, etc. I'm pretty sure he used to tape the amputated body parts at strange angles and places of the original body and hang them around the house and the surrounding forest. Around the same time, I and my sister used to adopt stray dogs and cats off the street, if we could catch them and feed them. I had recently caught a mangy and feisty street cat that didn't like me as much as it liked the food I gave it. He was a very willowy little fellow that tended to be able to get into places that seemed impossible to get to, which eventually got him into a bad situation I'll mention later. Anyway, back to Eric. As years passed, his mentality slowly got worse and worse until he was eventually killing strays, both on the street and the ones we fed, which is what happened to my cat. I believe he attempted, or at least planned the murder of several of us siblings, including me. Luckily, CPS got to us before he did, and took us all away. I think about him a lot and have a lot more stories about him, but I truly just hope that he's doing better now. I can't say much about who he was as a person since I didn't talk to him much, but I think the hanged mice in the living room said enough about him. I really hope that he's doing better now, but I never want to see him ever again. I wish him well, but I'm glad he's not in my life anymore.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.